Hello, everyone. Hello, every many. So glad to be back. We are back. We are the Redwoods, and we are so glad to be here. Thank you to all the wonderful volunteers who helped this event happen, and to all our fellow speakers. Let's go. So, we're the Redwoods. We are 13 people in one body. We identify as plural or multiple. We started becoming aware of our system in 2012. So it's been over 10 years of working together. And overall, we are very proud in love and building community within our system and beyond. I agree. Me too. Woohoo! So while it hasn't always been the case, we switch pretty quickly and we blur sometimes. And sometimes we have the energy or desire to share who is fronting. Like right now, I don't. Sometimes we don't. And that's great. This is Joy. Hi. So sometimes someone will say, like Joy just did now, who is fronting, but then not say when they switch, like, I don't feel like saying who I am. And that's okay. We're working together. Image description. We, the Redwoods, are in one white, trans feminine, non binary body with long, dark brown hair, blue eyes, and sitting in an office chair. Just want to say hi to littles and big people and everyone in between and beyond. It's Talk for Everyone. And also, it's going to contain some intense themes about trying to make the world a better place. People who've tried to do that, the reasons why we want to make the world a better place, including injustice and some of the contents of that. So take care of yourselves, take breaks. This will be recorded and shared, so you can come back to it another time or not come back to it if you need to leave and it's just like, no, this isn't for us. And we'll be around after the talk live and around on the internet, and you can catch up with us later. Just a huge thanks again to the Plural Positivity World Conference for creating this space to call us to bring forth what is the conversation that different speakers want to bring forth. So please support the Plural Association, and thanks for attending this conference. Okay. So we Redwoods think a lot about plural activism, making things better for systems, for people who are many in one body. And we really believe we need a social movement and a concerted, long-term, multi-generational effort to make things better. And that really starts within our systems. And a lot of that work no one else can see. So that's why we called this talk Invisible Plural Activism. We wanted to try to highlight just how much of this work is unseen, such that you might already be doing a lot of it. We're somewhat known in some spaces for doing somewhat visible activism, whether it's videos or talks or just being on Twitter. But even for us, a lot of it is about the invisible stuff. So just to highlight, if you're coming to this talk out of the context, you know, we're thinking of plural activism is for and by plurals. Plural, we're defining as anyone who's more than one. They might be many in one body. They might use terms like people, parts, alters, individuals, folks, beings, entities. We're curious, chat, if you want to share what words you use for yourselves. And we're talking about any origin. So there's a lot of different theories and ideas and identities around where people understand this to come from. And we think that that's really underdescribed, underexplored, and we welcome all origins. We also recognize that there's variable relationships to the psychiatric system. So it includes, dissociative identity disorder, otherwise specified dissociative disorders. Multiple personality disorder is still what some people in the world largely have heard of or even were diagnosed as. There's also, no diagnosis, self-diagnosis, post-diagnosis, and also identity is just completely separate from the idea of diagnosis or some combination. You could have any goal. You might want to remain as you are. You might want to move towards greater co-consciousness. You might be interested in fusion. You might be interested in, you might just be unsure. You might just be struggling to survive. Um, there, it's just about people who have this experience, regardless of where they came from or where they're going. And for us, it's any amount of time aware and any amount of time in the movement, including not yet aware, right? We're part of who we're working for is systems who don't know their systems yet, because we were all there once in a state of unawareness, or at least most of us. Um, and we definitely had a long period of our life where it would have been helpful to know, but we did not know. And we figured it out, and there was a lot of work there, right? And then even then, we weren't in the movement. There maybe wasn't as much of a movement when we figured it out in 2012 in some ways, but there also were a lot of people doing a lot of work um, around different subgroups of this community, and we just didn't know about it. And so we're thinking about those folks too who are out there who know they're a system, but are not uh, connected with others or with this particular effort. What does it mean to be invisible? It's easy to think that maybe invisible is good or bad or something we should try to change or recognize more. But invisible is a very complex idea. Uh, it, it, there's a lot of just vastness in the universe and things that we don't know about. Like I Googled invisible and I found this butterfly, just for image description, it's a purple butterfly with on a green leaf. That's kind of a blurry background with these beautiful kind of transparent wings. There's also, this is kind of a metaphorical image of kind of hands reaching up like a tree and then with a root system beneath it, right? There's stuff that we just don't see every day that makes up, we don't see the infrastructure of our cities, of our own bodies. We don't see the roots of trees around us. It's just kind of there. There's just a lot there, and we kind of grow an awareness of what's inside of us, around us. But it's not like, oh, I need to dig up the tree. It's so bad that it's invisible, you know? Actually, like forcing visibility can be harmful, right? It can be destructive. To extract, to dissect, can be violent even. So we can also respect the boundaries of the invisible. Sometimes it's not meant to be revealed, and other times there's highly contested debate about whether it should be shared or not. And when you start to think about mental health, some people make the case that a lot of stuff should remain invisible or should remain quiet, that others really, like us, really think should be shared. So there's two, this is Google's screenshot of Google's definition of invisible, and there's kind of the literal, unable to be seen, not visible to the eye, concealed from sight or hidden. But then there's the kind of more metaphorical, which is treated as if unable to be seen, ignored, or not taken into consideration. So, what does plural visibility look like, right? There's the literal challenge of being unable to see different system members. And then there's uh, the fact that our large presence in society is largely ignored or not taken into consideration. So it can mean some of these pretty painful things: unseen, ignored, hidden, avoided, denied, repressed, erased. But there's other benefits of being invisible. Right now, I'm visible to you, but I'm invisible to my neighbors because I have some privacy. I am not being overheard. I feel safe in my home. I feel comfortable. Uh, and there's a simplicity of just being alone together as the Redwoods. And most of the time we're here, the camera's not on. And not everything is meant to be turned inside out. When it comes to plurality, I'm curious about uh, what you all think about being invisible in the chat. What do you think it means to be invisible? One of the things that we've noticed is that there's a subjectivity of invisibility, right? Like we know that we're here most of the time. Sometimes we're not paying attention to each other or to ourselves even, but we have some level of visibility internally to each other, right? But then there's the outer world who doesn't necessarily see that unless we switch or we share about it. This is someone small. When it comes to being invisible, one of the things I like that that I have a space to go away, that I don't have to be on all the time. That's a nice thing about being plural. And I like that when I do want to come out, I can be like, hello. And I like that my system helps me think about when to come forward or not. Yeah. Anyone else? Invisible. I think that some stuff is like kind of kept out of sight for unless it's a special occasion. So there's certain places in our inner world that we're not always there or thinking about. There's also like certain people who we don't get to see all the time, internally, but also externally, interpersonal relationships. And I don't know, there's a shift in context, right? Like the sun after it sets is invisible for a bit. And then it becomes visible again. So there's a cyclical nature to visibility and invisibility that I think of. It's interesting. Yeah, I also just think that what sucks about invisibility is when you don't have a choice. So to me, the core theme is autonomy, right? Like I want to be able to be visible when it makes sense for me to be visible because I don't feel like hiding, or I feel like just being myself, and myself happens to be visible, visibly trans, visibly plural, visibly weird, visibly musical, visibly tired, whatever those things are. And I want to just be able to be that and not have people give me crap for it. And that's very important to me. Yeah. Yeah. And similarly, when I want these things that are on the screen of privacy, safety, and I want to withdraw and I want to recharge, I want to be able to have that too. And I think that to get those things like economic security and a place to live, your visible self has to be presentable to society in a particular way. And not everybody has equal access to those presentations. And so it's hard for many people to secure the safe places and ways to be invisible. Um, I also think that neglect is part of being invisible. Like we've neglected, it's easier to neglect things that are invisible, um, uh, that are not readily apparent, that are not right in your face. And then even the things that are right in our face that society doesn't want to deal with, even though it's visually visible, it becomes ignored as if it's invisible. So I think about homelessness, for example, in a lot of cities. You can see people living on the street right there, but it's just normalized. Say we want to make something visible, right? We think we made this kind of funny hyperbolic chart about, we were just thinking about the philosophical extremes of who knows, right? How visible. And so on the left, you have kind of no one ever, right? Completely unknown, unknowable, invisible. Uh, and then on the far end, in big caps, we have all beings across the multiverse, across species for all time. And it's hard to think of examples of things that all beings across the multiverse, across species for all time are constantly aware of. When we think about activism, the big examples, so perhaps Gandhi, King, Black Lives Matter, there's so many examples of the iconic, right? The big things that reached many people, and might have reached hundreds of millions of people now and for future generations, right? We hope. But a lot of those things kind of fade into the background at some point, right? It becomes less visible most of the time as an impact of activism and kind of just becomes normal. Having weekends are expression of a victory of the labor movement. But now in our day-to-day life, most people don't think of weekends as a product of the labor movement, and they don't see themselves as part of the labor movement. On the other end is there's just the things that someone somewhere knows. Like this talk, for example, like we had it in our system, right? And so we talked about it with our system, and we're discovering it kind of as we go, but we know about it, and now we're sharing it with you all. We're trying to move things up into the right of greater awareness, and we're also trying to recognize that we have to start with someone somewhere, with ourselves, right? And we can maybe promote the works of others that we know, and maybe promote a video or a book or a movement or an event or an action. But we are ourselves, someone somewhere trying to take something that we know and share it with a few people. So what is activism then? This is kind of Google's snippet about activism, which is highly based on the Wikipedia. There's some interesting things here. You have image of a person with a megaphone and some signs and banners, kind of a cartoon version of a street protest scene. You have some imagery of what looks like one of the marches from the civil rights movement, someone holding a cartoon sign of the National Organization of Women. So activism consists of efforts to promote, impede, direct, or intervene in social, political, economic, or environmental reform with the desire to make changes in society toward a perceived greater good. So you're trying to change something either by stopping it or starting it or intervening in it in a variety of different contexts, social, political, economic, because you think that whatever you're trying to do is good. And I think the important thing here is that activism is not inherently good. It is an expression of people trying to make a change, but there's a lot of activism that I heavily disagree with, that you heavily disagree with. And maybe some of my activism, whoever's watching this, you heavily disagree with, but it doesn't mean it's not activism, and you might do things that I heavily disagree with and maybe think are immoral. But it might be your perception of pushing society towards what you think a better society is. And we might radically disagree about what we think a better society is. You know, and I admire a lot of those people. You have Martin Luther King Jr., you have Greta Thunberg, Malcolm X, and Malala Yousafzai. And those are highly visible activists, you know, of the 1960s or of today. And there are other activists who represent very different viewpoints. There are people who hold viewpoints that I'm not even going to mention who are technically activists because they're trying to promote their own thing that I find disgusting, immoral, and horrible. And sometimes they win, right? Unfortunately. And then we have to do activism to counter that. A lot going on in the world. And yes, so there's also this idea of activist organizations, right? So there's individuals, but also organizations, and organizations could be more or less visible. They have an interesting list here. Yeah. Activism can include making things visible. So this idea that injustice must be exposed, right? I'll read the quote shortly. It's from the letter from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King Jr. So the context was that a lot of the images of the civil rights movement are of Black protesters being attacked by white police with hoses, dogs, things like that. And a lot of that came out of nonviolent direct action work of King and his associates, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, many different activists. And they were accused of causing trouble. He says, you know, there's the Klansmen and the white supremacists who are opponents, but there's this bigger challenge of the white moderate, the people who say you're trying to do too much, too fast, too soon. Just wait. Your tactics are too disruptive. You're causing tension and you're causing trouble. And this is one of our favorite quotes about activism. Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with. Like a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, injustice must be exposed with all the tension its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. Very fascinating that there's just this long history in activism of thinking about how can we show what's going on in a way that is understandable, immediately highlighted as wrong, and how can we bring things out into the open? So it's interesting to think about how are we as a plural movement bringing things into visible presence, and what is yet to be exposed, because I think we have a long way to go. And when you have maybe a lot of the harm is in psychiatric contexts, how do we expose the harms of the healthcare system? Of course, though, even as these movements and famous people from history were doing these things, it wasn't just like Dr. King or Malcolm X or any particular iconic member of any movement. In the civil rights movement, there's been a lot of writing about who are the people behind the icons. There's this book, Invisible Activists by Lee Sartain. The subtitle is Women of the Louisiana NAACP and the Struggle for Civil Rights from 1915 to 1945. And it's basically exploring the idea that, hey, actually the most of the people doing most of the work at this critical time in that state's civil rights organizing were women, and they are just not recognized. But without them, the work really wouldn't have existed. Bayard Rustin is a gay man who was a major organizer with King, but was not really recognized widely at the time, and kind of took a backseat in a lot of different ways. So there's this effort to elevate in history different groups and individuals who maybe were missed at the time to try to understand things. And I think that it's similarly important in our movement work to think about what groups of the past have existed, who are plural, who would fall under the plural movement, whether or not they called themselves that at the time, that have been erased or left out of the narrative, and who now is doing work today that is not known by most people, and is not necessarily the face of plural activism, but is very important to the movement. And I think also it's just important to think about there's limits to the theoretical political science concepts around social movements, but I also think that it's interesting to think about. So this is what are the stages of social movements? And there's this phrase: emerge, coalesce, bureaucratize, and then there's all these different things that can happen. So in the emergence period, it's people coming together. It's like it's starting to happen, right? Coalescing, figuring out our structures. Bureaucratize is like, how do you actually deploy the movement? How does it get organized? What organizations? What structures? How does it get funded? Is it partly within the government, academia? Where are the institutional bodies? Because just individuals enough can't achieve the demands of the movement, right? And then it might succeed, it might fail. Sometimes it gets co-opted or repressed, or it can go mainstream, and then all these things can lead to decline. I would say for us, it's interesting to think about, but I think that we're somewhere in the emerge and coalesce period with a few people, trying to set up organizations, but we're still very early. And I'd say that this model is simple, right? Like at any point, little efforts can succeed, fail, be co-opted, repressed, or go mainstream. So it's just an interesting model to think about. Curious about your thoughts about this one. So I have this little green dot over here, and to me, this represents the most visible activism in like a sea of larger society, right? So we have all of the world, and then there's these activists over here. And one of the things that we wanted to represent is that, those activists have a core group of supporters, and they really couldn't exist without those people. And those people are working hard and they're very dedicated. And then there's a larger ecosystem supporting all those people, movements, uh, activists, lots of different kinds of folks. And then those folks have their own support systems. And then there's even more like different supporters and attention and a lot of different things. So any visible activism is largely supported by a whole. We just thought it looked kind of like a fish. So just a little rainbow fish break. Take a breath. So what are we trying to change? There's this social ecological model that came up from Uri Bronfenbrenner in the 1970s. You'll often see it represented like this. This is an adaptation, and I'll show a few more. There's this idea of like, the individual level, the interpersonal level, community, organizations, institutions, policies, and the culture. There's something missing here, though, for plurals. Here's a much more complicated model. Individual, relationships, organizations, community, policy, society. Again, based on that work. And there's all these great examples. You can pause this later. But it attempts to look at like, okay, at the social level, somebody's well-being is influenced by oppression and racism and societal conflict and environmental forces and natural disasters. But then if you jump down, for example, to the relationships level, family and peers, social connections, the experience of parenting, personal, interpersonal violence. Okay, let's look at the red in the rainbow as society, and then you could say orange is policy, yellow is communities, and you have family in green, and blue is the individual level, right? But for systems, you have the indigo and the violet. You have these individual system members, this individual system member level, and then you also have the internal relationships level. The center of our plural lives is erased in most sociological models, in policy, and in all thinking about that starts from the individual. So there's this pressure to hide. There's this conceptual erasure that people just don't even know that we're there. And then there's erasure in the form of loss of freedom and sadly in loss of lives, right? And that leads to avoiding focusing on individual system members and intra-system dynamics. And that's really important. Before we get into that further, some of us are more erased than others. So various layers of power, privilege, oppression, and solidarity exist. So we have that individual member level of, so individual system members. So this is Z, I'm a system member. At the individual member level, internally to each system member, there's aspects of myself that I don't even know about, that are visible to me that are or not. And then at the system level, I have maybe relationships with other system members that are more or less strong, and different system members have different levels of autonomy within our system. And obviously, both of those things we want to explore greater inclusion, acceptance. I want to accept all the aspects of myself as an individual system member, and I also want to accept all the members of my system and think about what equity and inclusion looks like at the system member level. So an example of internal inclusion work is to think about who feels safe in your system and who doesn't feel safe and why. And are there behaviors interpersonally inside of your system that contribute to some people feeling less safe. This is Ali, I think, a lot about how some people take up space in ways, especially because we share a body, right, that can be harmful to others. So if somebody is avoiding um, the needs of an individual system member or is actively harming the rest of the system through neglect or abuse, there's some need for intervention. And that intervention is a form of activism, right? So interpersonally, you know, anti-plural sentiment is augmented by external inequity. So racism, classism, sexism, anti-trans, and other ableism, other experiences um, mean that some systems have an easier time being seen in the world, as hard as it is for anyone, than others. Um, Basically, some systems have access to community that others don't have access to. And there's geographic and cultural wide variation around the world and in each region. And there's more and more facets of whether or not someone has the ability to be visible if they want to be. I just want to highlight a few forgotten groups. Speakers of most languages are just forgotten in the conversation. There's too much bias towards English currently. Um, we want to highlight, and content warning, those in institutional isolation. So there's people who are plural in prisons, cults, detention centers, psych wards. And those are folks who are difficult to reach at this time. And we might not be able to reach them immediately in big ways, but we can slowly grow our capacity and find uh, different interventions to reach and support systems wherever they are. There's also people without access to technology. A lot of this is online, including this conference. People in most countries, you know, are not going to have the same access and awareness as folks in the US, even however small that awareness is. Systems who don't follow psychiatric narratives face specific barriers to um, being visible, to being accepted. And then obviously people in active crisis who are unhoused or in poverty, um, you know, various states of vulnerability. It takes privilege to make and occupy a platform um, in this unfair world. And it doesn't mean that you need to feel bad about your ability to do that, but you do need to think about how you can, as you grow awareness and help more systems, part of that can be helping systems less advantaged than ourselves to grow, advance as leaders of this emerging movement. Yeah, and so I'm just curious who else, in the chat, who else is particularly erased, left out, or unheard? How can you become visible, right? So how can you know who's there uh, and understand yourselves individually and get to know yourself as a system member? So you want your system to keep track of who's there and you want folks to check in and acknowledge. Um, I won't read everything here, but there's some ideas. The other thing that I would say is just acknowledging your wholeness as an individual. So this is Ali, for example. It's important for me to remember that I'm not just a personality, that I'm not just the girly one or the feminine one or the one who likes fashion or, like those, whatever stereotype I might be brought into. It's important to think about it as like, I'm just I'm a whole person. So it's also helpful, and there's resources on kinhost.org, Power of the Plurals, and talks from this conference about how to tend to and reveal the intrasystem relationships. So what's really been helpful for us is structured facilitation. So, time with therapists, working with us as a group. So we've also had friends do this and facilitators and mediators who work with our organizations will take us and sit us down and work with us as an organization, where it's like, okay, what is fairness look like? What are our values in our system right now? And are we reflecting that in our system? And do people feel like they are equal participants? And it's a work in progress. It takes a lot of work. Yeah. And part of that is considering your governance structures. For smaller systems, it might look really different than much larger systems, but in general, you're wanting to think about how you work together. The other thing I would add is just making time for each dyad or small group set of relationships to the extent that you can, and dealing with internal jealousy, internal conflict about envy, or I want to be with that person, you're with that person, I want to be with that person, and creating an equanimity, a capacity to accept each other's relationships and care for each other. There's also effort. It takes effort to become visible to those outside of your system, right? And if you're coming out to someone, that is a form of activism, because you can really change that person. You can change that person's impression. You might help them realize they're plural, but you're definitely going to make them someone who knows more about it. Now, that might not be a safe person to come out to or not. And we talked about our coming out panel from PPWC in 2020, I believe, with us and a few other systems. So definitely think about more about the topic of coming out, but it is powerful. It's also very important to spend time with other plurals. So I just want to talk about the avoidance of spending time with other plurals. We Redwoods have met a few dozen systems we've gotten to know pretty well, and we've probably met in passing over 100 systems. And there's still a massive temptation to run away. There's still a massive temptation to be like, oh yeah, that was a phase in my life, and now I don't talk to those people anymore because look, I can be normal and I can hold like a job, and I don't know, and I don't have to be like this anymore. I'm done, but it's not true. I'm not done. The more we heal, the more we're us, and the more we're us, the more we heal. But it's very painful to feel the shame and the discrimination that happens being us, and it's natural to want it to be some other way. But the real other way is self-acceptance, working together to create change, and also taking time to take breaks. And one of the biggest ways that we've been able to take breaks is by spending time with other systems. And, we have a close system friend who we met at a conference early on in 2013, and then we avoided them. And then we went back to the conference the next year, and we spent hours together and had a great time. And then we kind of avoided them. And finally, years later, we've reconnected. But it hurts me to think about the pain that could have been avoided if I just let myself accept plural relationships into our life earlier on. It's good to establish areas of your life where you're generally open about it. So we started coming out in like different activist circles that weren't necessarily plural activism. We came out to some meditation spaces or to some dance groups. Having those different areas kind of helped lay some foundation, and also changed larger groups of people that were relatively low stakes. Like and then when you have those areas of comfort, you can kind of start spreading those areas of comfort to other areas of your life. It's important to also honor, no matter how visible you are, that a huge portion of your life together as a system is invisible to others and very visible to your own system. It can often be like, oh, I'm alone and no one knows anything. It's like, but actually, like, your system members are someone. And yeah, you all might be collectively under resourced and struggling together, but you all are somebodies, and you're not alone. Let's talk about big visibility. So you're leading rooms on stage and media going viral, and then things that we haven't really seen in the plural movement yet, which is like highly visible protests covered in national media, maybe national bestsellers, activist figureheads gone mainstream on live national news, people running for office, political leaders, movements, all kinds of different types of things. All of that comes with a huge amount of just survival and care work. So all the work to care and survive for ourselves as plural systems, and then also for each other, mutual aid efforts, communities, friendships, like that's a huge, huge part of that bigger circle that we shared. And then the specifically activist activities, there's a ton of prep work and there's a lot of failed attempts before any big success. And so it's important to just remember that, like, if you have a specific tangible goal of like, reducing a terrible statistic or creating access to resources, that's going to take a long time, a lot of work, and you got to take care of yourself in that time and process. So we took some time to reflect on our own visible and invisible plurality. So I'll just start on the right. So we were in a video that has 20 million views on Anthony Padilla's channel. We've had press mentions. We were in BBC Radio and local news in the Bay Area. And so maybe that reached 500,000 to 5 million people cumulatively. And then there's the talks that we give that maybe 10,000 people reached, and then we're out to family, friends, and work, and maybe that's another 1,000 people, right? So that puts it, but what those people are aware of is like some flash of us in social media, some piece of our writing, or some type of presentation, educational mode. Maybe our closer friends, maybe those 500 people who are vaguely aware, they're like, oh, they've heard us talk about it, share a concept or two, and then there's like names and needs. And that's kind of, you could just look at it as that, like, wow, okay, the Redwoods did that. Underneath the surface of the iceberg, underneath the water, it gets a lot more like cold and lonely. So there's things that our closest 10 or 20 systems to us know about us. So close friends who've known us for a long time, we're a plural, and then maybe 20 singlets who've really taken the time to get to know us and really think about it. And then there's still just like most of our life they don't know about. And then maybe 2 or 3 outsiders know a lot. And then there's what only we know, and then what only some of us know. So we talked about kind of a stream of consciousness of what most people don't know. Most people don't know what we're like when we relax. Most people don't know what it's like to play video games with us. Most people don't know our hopes, wishes, and dreams. They don't know our stress, our struggles, our anxiety, what's pleasurable for us, what we feel like when we're really free. Most people don't know what it's like for the Redwoods to have fun. We might have a little model fun, presented fun, haha, banter back and forth. But like when we're really having fun and what that means for all of us as a system and what the switching looks like when we're having a good time, people don't know. Like we could document that and present it, but like it's hard to share. You got to live our life with us. And so very few people get to have that experience, and we would like more, but it's lonely out here, It's even harder to articulate what it's like to love each other inside. It's just so hard to love each other so much, and then to face the discrimination and the juxtaposition of like, wow, I really love these people and they're so great and I live with them every day. And then people still assume this horrible crap about us, and it's just the juxtaposition is really painful, but it's very powerful to have that knowledge of the love that we have for each other and to have that lived experience, because in the beginning, when we started figuring out who we were, we were like so scared. We were so scared. And we really internalized a lot of that negative narrative, and it's still there, but yeah, we love each other. Yay. And we really want that to be respected. Yeah. but I want to talk about the shame. Oh my God, every day, so much shame. There's the shame around being plural, but for us, we have CPTSD. You know, we're survivor. We are trauma survivors. We are just struggling with the trauma of discrimination of being trans, and living through this time in society. You blame yourself. You feel not good enough. And we have really complex struggles where people will get really deep in coping, need a lot of care and attention, and then other aspects of our system life get neglected. So and I hope that we through events like this can get, and as a community, gain more confidence talking about these things. Not just like, here's, another 101 video explaining these major concepts, or like, here's what you need to know. But like, what is it really like to struggle with group decision making, and how do we show that? How do we tell more stories about that? How do we talk about our deep pains and frustrations, and not like, oh, I'm plural and it's horrible and I need to stop being plural, but like, it really hurts that I don't know, that I haven't gotten to go on a date with a particular system member who I want to go on a date with for so long, just because stuff is so intense, and we struggle with how it feels unfair for the two of us to go off on our own when there's so many needs across the whole system. And how do we reconcile the different fairness dynamics, and how do we create space for everyone's hopes and dreams internally? Like, that's more painful and frustrating than like whatever society thinks is hard about this. And all of that is essential to everything big that anyone accomplishes, right? And it's so important to spend deep time beneath the surface. Go for the big wins. Go for the breakthroughs. Let's freaking change society. Let's really change things. Like, there's so much that needs to change. Be big. Go big, please. Like, go bigger than any of us can conceive right now. Go, let's do it. Let's transform media. Let's transform psychiatry, psychology, healthcare, education, just what it's like to walk down the street and talk out loud to each other. Let's change. There's a lot that needs to change. And let's change the confidence of dating as plural, of um, working in a variety of industries, of all these things. And it's going to take time. So just to reiterate, find the things other than that big work which sustain you, because all the big things are rare and take a lot of work and risk. So what are some sources of energy and support? You got personal relationships and community with other systems. You got large groups of singlet supporters that you need to build, because there's just not enough plural community in our experience to do it with just plurals. You got to find some folks you can trust who are singlets. One strategy that we're trying right now is a career that doesn't depend on plural activism. So I would like to talk about the topic of careers. So there's this book called The Lifelong Activist by Hilary Reddig, and it's available online. And there's a section about, basically saying have a career. So it's very hard to sustain yourself with activism financially, and being alive in this world costs money. Right now, we are more invisible than in the past, because we're trying to have a career that's not related to being plural. We're trying to be openly plural in that work. One of the thoughts was that it would be helpful for us to experience the realities of trying to be plural in the workplace, and so that we could help think about transforming workplaces to be more plural inclusive, because maybe we would make it as a big plural icon or something and be able to afford like rent and stuff, but maybe not. But there's like millions of plurals, and not every plural can be a professional plural activist, if any can, right? We're particularly at an early stage in this movement. So the big stuff is kind of just getting started, and it's very important. There's this idea of activism as dying for the cause. But really, we mostly need people to live for the cause. It's a really long life, and there's a lot of work to do. And really, again, that idea of the lifelong activist, like we'll hopefully live to our 90s. We want to retain enthusiasm and love for this work, and find ways to make it more and more sustainable over time. And we want you all to be able to do that too. We want to be able to grow old with other plural activists, and also by then see, a scale of activism coming forward and change and that we haven't seen before. Plural activism is also plurals doing activism that they believe in. So, disability justice, climate justice, racial justice, all these economic justice, like all that obviously benefits plurals, but also it's part of our greater sense of justice and expressing who we are and what we care about and our values. And social movements need to be inclusive of plurals. And also, even when they're not, we need to find ways to participate in pursuit of justice that we care about. So I still need a functioning climate, even if the climate movement is not particularly plural friendly. So what does it look like for me to create sustainable pathways for me to contribute what I want to contribute to climate justice, um, uh, given the level of plural acceptance or not that exists there? It's not an excuse for anti-plural sentiment, but it's more just like, hey, I recognize that in my lifetime, I'm going to want to work on issues where I can't necessarily transform everyone working on that, prejudice against plurals. How can I exist as us out in the world, and get done what I need to get done, not just earning money or, securing my basic needs, but also like, how do I fight for what I care about in the world, even if not everyone in those movements is necessarily fully aligned with who we are. That's real coalition building, and it's tough work. It's tough work. Hopefully, future generations of plurals will have fewer trade-offs to make, because it will be more widely accepted and understood and embraced. Yeah, because the other thing I wanted to say is that, like, we have just a ton to give when it comes to movements, because of who we are. So to exclude us from relationships is to lose out on relationships. To exclude us from activism is to lose activists. There's a lot of us here. There's a lot of us, and we have a lot of ideas. And we have a lot to give. Last thing we want to say is this last bottom, the small impacts, thank you notes from people as an example. Hold on to the little things. So please, if we have helped you ever, please message us and tell us. We have dissociation. We forget. We have toxic shame. We get down on ourselves. And every little thank you or positive affirmation, it means so much to activists. It means so much, but particularly to plural activists. And I want to stop and be very clear about something. The movement needs funding. The movement needs funding. The movement needs funding. And so if someone has helped you and you have money, and please support them financially. Please support the Plural Association. Please support the other speakers. We're thankfully okay right now, which is new. But we have a lot of visions of a lot of work that needs to get done, right? Right now, we're not doing a lot, but like, if you have $100,000, $5,000, $1,000, $100, there are things that we know you can do with that money, that can help others. Mutual aid is very important. If you need money, if you need help, please express it. That also helps people, because honestly, if you're listening to this talk and you've gotten this far, chances are you're an activist, and chances are the movement needs you, and you caring for yourself is going to help the movement continue to exist. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Audre Lorde, Black revolutionary feminist. What we need as systems is not self-indulgence. It's not self-indulgence. It's not an elaborate seeking attention. It's not too much. This world is so full of abundance. We live in a very unequal society. To have what we need is okay. To have more than what we need, think about Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Murray Brown. It's not about just having the bare minimum. It's about abundance. We are abundantly peopled in our system, right? We have more than most people have. And we also have sometimes different and sometimes more needs than other people have. So please consider that part of the change is a world in which people can have their needs met and they can have joy and fun and comfort and abundance and security. And that every step you can take to give that to yourselves hopefully will help you learn how to envision that for other systems as well. And it's a role model. So come towards the end here, plural activism needs a scale of organization bigger than any system or organization which exists today. Again, the big thing, and that can only come from millions of system members and singlet allies taking millions of small actions, which means your system living your life and helping others and movements when you can. Invisible doesn't mean good or bad. It's just a fact. And sometimes we want to make the invisible visible. Other times it just is what it is. The key is to remember that it takes a lot of invisible to make something visible. And so I see the work that these activists are doing here at this conference that are even if the rest of the world doesn't. And when my activist friends see us, that is really supportive. And also think about that, be open to the fact that there's a lot of experience that we don't know, that there's things that are invisible to us that are out there and that we don't know about yet, and keep an open mind. That said, there's a lot of messed up stuff that needs to be exposed. There's a lot of history, and there's also a lot of wonderful stuff that deserves to be exposed. So whether it's for confronting evil or expressing good, we should find more and more ways to share things. A last thought experiment here is, what are plural liberations, right? If liberation is the process of freeing someone or something from control or limits of expression or oppression, what is plural liberation? At the individual system member level, what does it mean to be free in our system relationships, in our daily life, and in the bigger than that? What does it mean for all systems to be free? What would that look like? Very curious what you think. Thank you so much for attending and the space. And once again, thanks to the venue and to the volunteers. It's a real honor to be part of this community. It always helps us to participate. We feel a big pull to run away, like we mentioned. And sometimes we don't have to be visible to the whole world. Just being able to be visible to our community helps us a ton. So also encourage you to consider giving a talk in the future. Consider you to participate in volunteering to get involved in other organizing, to find plural communities that make meaning for you. Um, thank you for helping us uh, in your process of changing the world. And thank you for the opportunity to help change the world a little bit with this talk. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks.